The dense fog hung low over the forest, turning every shadow into an unsettling presence. Daniel hesitated at the edge of the trailing, his breath shallow, every instinct screaming at him to turn back. But something pulled him forward. Perhaps curiosity, perhaps the strange, forgotten memory that gnawed at the back of his mind. The path before him was barely visible, swallowed by the gnarled branches overhead. Each step felt heavier, the air colder. It wasn't just the chill of the evening. It was the kind of cold that crawled under your skin, seeping into your bones, whispering that this place was wrong. As he ventured deeper, the forest grew darker, even though the sun hadn't fully set. The trees, thick and twisted, seemed to move subtly, as if they were adjusting themselves, watching him. The silence was oppressive, more so than any place he had ever been. No birds, no wind, no distant rustle of leaves, just an overwhelming quiet that gnawed at his nerves. The only sound was his own heartbeat, loud and erratic in his ears. He felt eyes on him, though he saw no one. And then, through the veil of mist, he saw it, an old, crumbling structure hidden among the trees. The cabin was dilapidated, its roof sagging under the weight of time, the windows broken like the eyes of a forgotten soul. Vines and moss clung to its sides, as if nature itself was trying to swallow it whole. Something about the place felt off, as though it wasn't just abandoned, it was forsaken. A chill ran down his spine as he stepped closer, the hairs on the back of his neck standing on end. The feeling of being watched intensified, but there was no one around, no movement in the trees, no sign of life. The front door creaked open with the lightest touch, as if it had been waiting for him. The interior was worse than the outside, a tomb of dust and decay. The furniture was rotting, the floorboards creaked ominously underfoot, and the air smelled of mildew and something faintly metallic. As Daniel stepped inside, the light from the setting sun barely filtered through the broken windows, casting long, jagged shadows across the room. His breath hitched when he noticed something peculiar. The shadows weren't aligned with the objects that cast them. They seemed independent, moving ever so slightly, out of sync with reality. His heart pounded in his chest as a low creak echoed from somewhere deeper in the cabin. He wasn't alone. The air grew thick with tension, and his every instinct told him to leave. But his legs, heavy with fear, refused to move. He stared at the shadows, watching as they twitched, shifted, almost as if they were alive, observing him. His hands trembled as he fumbled for his phone, but when he raised it to use the flashlight, the screen flickered and died, the light extinguished as quickly as it had appeared. Panic surged through him. Something brushed against his arm. It was cold, like ice, but when he turned, there was nothing there. His pulse raced as he slowly backed toward the door, but then it slammed shut with a force that shook the walls. The silence returned, suffocating, and with it, an overwhelming sense of dread. He could feel something watching him, something malevolent, hiding just beyond the edges of the room. Daniel's breath quickened as a faint sound reached his ears. A whisper, faint at first, almost like a breath carried on the wind, but it grew louder, more insistent, until it was unmistakable. Daniel! The whisper came from the shadows, and in that moment, Daniel realized he hadn't stumbled upon this place by accident. Something had been waiting for him all along. As Daniel stood frozen in the eerie silence of the cabin, a flicker of recognition pierced through the fog of fear clouding his mind. The place was foreign, yet there was something disturbingly familiar about it. His eyes scanned the decaying room, the rotting furniture, the crumbling walls. And then he saw it, half buried under a pile of dust and debris, barely visible in the dim light, was an old music box. Its faded gold exterior was tarnished with age, but Daniel would recognize it anywhere. It was the same music box from his childhood, the one his mother used to wind up for him every night before bed, its soft, haunting melody lulling him to sleep. But he had lost it years ago during a family trip to these very woods. A cold shiver ran down his spine. Memories he had long buried began to surface, images flashing in his mind like disjointed fragments of a nightmare. He remembered the trip, The long drive, the unfamiliar roads, the arguments between his parents. He had wandered off, chasing a butterfly deeper into the woods, farther than he should have gone. And then the memory cut off, a gaping void where there should have been something. His mother had told him he was lost for hours before they found him, but Daniel had never recalled what happened during that time. It was a blank space in his mind that had haunted him his entire life, a piece of himself missing, forgotten. Now, standing in the cabin, with the music box sitting before him, that missing piece began to fall into place. His heart raced as he knelt down, fingers trembling as he reached for the box. As his skin made contact with the cold metal, a sharp pain shot through his wrist. His old scar, the one he had never been able to explain, began to burn as if freshly cut. He recoiled in shock, clutching his arm as the dull, throbbing ache grew more intense. It was the same scar he had gotten after being lost in these woods all those years ago. A scar that had never healed properly and had always caused him discomfort when he thought too much about that day. As he stared at the scar, memories began to bleed into his consciousness. Hazy, fragmented visions of the past. He remembered being a child, stumbling through the woods, lost and terrified. He had come across a clearing. No, this clearing, and in it, he had seen the cabin, standing just as it was now. But something else was there, something that lurked in the shadows, something that watched him. He could hear a voice, a soft, insistent whisper that called his name, just as it did now. Daniel's breath quickened as the pieces of the puzzle began to fit together, though the picture they painted was one of unspeakable horror. He had been here before. He had been inside this cabin as a child, and whatever had happened to him in those lost hours, it had left a mark, both on his body and on his soul. The music box had been his, yes, but it had been taken from him by something or someone that still lingered here. His mother had never been able to explain how he came back with that scar, or why he had been so distant, so different after that trip. His fingers moved almost on their own, winding the rusted crank of the music box. A grinding sound filled the air, followed by the soft, haunting melody he had forgotten. It was the same song, the same notes that used to comfort him, but now the sound seemed distorted, wrong. The melody echoed through the cabin, reverberating off the decaying walls, and with it came a sudden wave of nausea. The room seemed to darken, the shadows growing longer, deeper, as if they were reaching out for him. As the music played, Daniel's scar pulsed in time with the rhythm, the pain intensifying until it felt as though his arm was on fire. He dropped the music box with a gasp, stumbling backward as a flood of memories rushed into his mind. Memories of that day, memories he had repressed for years. He saw himself as a child, standing in the cabin, looking into the darkness. And from that darkness, something had looked back. A sharp crack echoed through the cabin as the music box hit the floor, the lid snapping shut. The melody stopped abruptly, leaving the cabin in a suffocating silence. Daniel's breathing was ragged, his heart pounding in his chest as the weight of realization settled over him. Whatever had happened to him that day had never really ended. It had just been waiting for him to return. And now, it had him exactly where it wanted. The silence after the music box stopped was worse than the eerie melody. Daniel stood in the dim light, his heart pounding in his chest, his body frozen with dread. His mind raced, piecing together the fragmented memories and the growing terror that something was very wrong. He could feel the cabin breathing around him, the air thick with an unseen presence. The shadows moved unnaturally, flickering along the walls like they had a life of their own. And then, from deep within the cabin, a faint, barely audible voice began to speak. It was not a whisper this time, but something more insidious, echoing from within the very walls. Daniel. The voice was soft, yet filled with malice, as if it had been waiting for him all these years. You took something from us. Now it's time to give it back. Daniel's stomach twisted in fear. He tried to turn toward the door to leave, but his legs felt as though they were stuck in place, rooted to the floor by an invisible force. The shadows around him thickened, coalescing into vague, humanoid shapes. He could feel their cold, oppressive gaze, though they had no eyes. Panic surged through him as the voice spoke again, louder this time, echoing through his mind, not just his ears. You must choose one memory, one sacrifice. You took from us, and now you will give. The words hit him like a punch to the gut, leaving him gasping for breath. A sacrifice. His mind spun as he struggled to comprehend what was happening. And then he realized the shadows were offering him a choice. He had taken something from this place as a child, something he couldn't remember, and now they demanded payment in return. His thoughts raced, trying to make sense of it all, but the shadows seemed to grow more impatient, circling him like predators waiting to pounce. In front of him, the shadows solidified into a nightmarish form. Its limbs were elongated, twisting unnaturally, and its face, it had no face, just a dark, empty void where features should have been. It loomed over him, the air around it freezing, and then it stretched out a long, skeletal hand, pointing directly at him. Daniel's body stiffened in terror as the voice hissed once more, this time inside his head. You can leave, but not without a price. You will give up the memory that makes you whole. What will you sacrifice, Daniel? Choose, or we will choose for you. His heart raced as the realization hit him. They wanted a part of him, his past, his memories, something precious. Daniel felt trapped, paralyzed by the weight of the decision before him. The shadows pulsed, as if feeding on his fear, growing stronger with every second he hesitated. He knew deep down that if he didn't choose, they would take something far worse. But the thought of losing a part of himself forever, it was too much to bear. His mind flashed to the most precious memory he held. The smile of his mother, her face soft and kind, the way she had looked at him the last time he saw her alive. She had died when he was young, and that memory was one of the only things that kept him grounded, that connected him to his past. The thought of losing it was like a knife twisting in his chest. Could he give that up? Could he sacrifice the memory of the person who had loved him most? But the alternative. Daniel's gaze flickered toward the shadows, dark and hungry, waiting for his decision. He knew that if he didn't offer them something, they would take more than just a memory. They would take him, body and soul, just like they had done to whoever or whatever had come before. He could feel it in the air, the weight of all the lost souls trapped in this place, echoes of their terror whispering from the walls. The voice came again, closer now, the cold breath of the shadows on his skin. Give it to us, or you will never leave this place. Daniel's breath hitched in his throat as tears stung his eyes. He had no choice. To survive, he had to give them what they wanted. Slowly, trembling, he closed his eyes and whispered, "Take it. Take the memory." A cold wind swept through the cabin, and for a moment, Daniel felt something rip from his mind, a searing, unbearable pain that left him gasping, as if a piece of his very soul had been torn away. His body convulsed, and his vision blurred as the memory of his mother faded, her face slipping away like sand through his fingers. The warmth of her smile, the softness of her voice, it was gone, erased. The shadows around him seemed to shudder, satisfied, retreating slightly. The air was still cold, but lighter somehow, as though the cabin had taken its due. Daniel collapsed to his knees, breathing heavily, tears streaming down his face. The emptiness inside him was unbearable, a hollow, gaping wound where once there had been warmth. He had made the choice, and now he had to live with it. But even as the shadows pulled back, something in the cabin shifted, a low, deep groan from the floorboards, and the faintest, almost imperceptible whisper. Not enough. The oppressive silence of the cabin had returned, but it wasn't the kind of quiet that brought peace. Instead, it felt as though the air itself was waiting, holding its breath, preparing for something to come. Daniel sat on the floor, his mind numb from the sacrifice he had just made. The memory of his mother was gone, leaving behind an emptiness so profound it was as if a piece of his soul had been ripped away. He could barely comprehend what had just happened, but deep down, he knew something wasn't right. The shadows had retreated, but the cabin still felt wrong, alive, as if it was aware of his every breath. The floor creaked beneath him, but this time, it wasn't the natural sound of aging wood. It was deliberate, like a footstep. Daniel's eyes darted around the room, heart pounding again, as the dim light seemed to flicker. The shadows that had once surrounded him began to stir once more, this time moving of their own accord. They slithered along the walls, pooling in the corners of the room, creeping toward him like black, oily tendrils. His pulse quickened, and he scrambled to his feet, backing away toward the door. But the door didn't budge. It was as if the entire cabin had sealed itself shut, trapping him inside. The walls groaned again, and the shadows grew bolder, stretching across the room like living things. Daniel's breath came in shallow gasps as the temperature plummeted. He could see his breath in the air now, each exhalation a puff of cold mist. The walls, which had seemed solid just moments before, now looked warped. They would seem to shift, bulging outward, as if something was inside the walls, pressing against them, trying to break free. The whispers returned, but this time they weren't just inside his head. They were everywhere. A chorus of hushed voices filled the room, coming from the very structure of the cabin itself. They were faint, fragmented, like pieces of a conversation that had been sliced apart. Some sounded distant, others too close for comfort, and all of them were speaking his name. Daniel! He spun around, trying to locate the source of the voices, but they seemed to come from every direction. Panic surged in his chest as the shadows began to shift again, but now they were taking shape. Human-like figures began to form from the darkness. Tall, elongated beings with no features, just hollow voids where their faces should be. They moved slowly, deliberately, as if savoring the moment, their eyeless faces turning toward him. Daniel's body trembled with fear as one of the figures reached out, its arm unnaturally long, fingers stretching like claws toward him. He backed up, his hands searching blindly for anything to defend himself with. But there was nothing, just the overwhelming presence of the shadows. They encircled him now, closing in, the air thick with their oppressive weight. The whispers grew louder, almost deafening, as though the cabin itself was breathing them into existence. Suddenly, the walls seemed to pulse. Thump, thump, like a heartbeat. The floor beneath him vibrated with each pulse, sending a sickening wave of nausea through him. The cabin was alive. There was no doubt now. It was watching him, feeding on his fear, bending reality around him. Daniel's vision blurred, and for a moment, the walls seemed to melt, the wood twisting into grotesque shapes, faces forming in the knots of the timber, mouths open in silent screams. The cabin shifted around him, warping, stretching, making him feel like he was trapped inside a nightmare that refused to end. He stumbled toward the window, hoping to break through, but the glass had turned opaque, as if the outside world had ceased to exist. He was trapped in a pocket of unreality, a place where the rules of the world no longer applied. The shadows followed him relentlessly, their forms solidifying, becoming more and more human-like with every step. And then, one of the shadow figures whispered, "You remember us, Daniel. You've been here before." His blood ran cold. The words echoed in his mind, stirring memories that were too painful, too fragmented to grasp. He had been here before, but why? How? His thoughts were tangled, lost in the fog of fear. The shadows pressed closer, their whispers taking on a mocking tone, each voice more malicious than the last. "You never left." The walls pulsed again, harder this time, and Daniel felt a deep, resonating thrum through his bones. The cabin was drawing him in, pulling at his mind, unraveling the last threads of his sanity. The shadows seemed to merge with the walls, their forms stretching and twisting, until they were no longer distinguishable from the structure itself. They were part of the cabin, or the cabin was part of them. Desperation clawed at him as he tried to scream, but no sound came out. His voice was swallowed by the thick, suffocating air. The whispers turned into a low, droning hum, and the figures grew closer, their clawed hands reaching for him. Daniel's heart pounded in his chest, the pulse in his ears deafening. The reality of the cabin was warping around him, and he knew, without a doubt, that if he didn't find a way out, it would consume him, just like it had consumed so many others before. And then, in the corner of his eye, he saw it, a faint glow, a small crack of light in the far corner of the room, barely noticeable but unmistakable in the sea of darkness. It was the only thing that didn't move, the only thing that seemed real in this place of madness. Hope flared in his chest, but it was fleeting. The shadows hissed, their forms closing in, sensing his desperation. They knew he had seen the light, and they were determined to stop him. The walls pulsed once more, the entire cabin groaning under the weight of the malevolent force within it. Daniel had one chance, one last, desperate chance. He had to reach the light before the shadows took him, before the cabin swallowed him all. The faint glow in the corner of the room was the only thing tethering Daniel to sanity, but it seemed impossibly far away. The shadows pressed in closer, whispering dark promises, distorting reality with every flicker of their formless shapes. His breathing was shallow, labored, as if the very air had thickened, turning into something heavy, something wrong. Every step toward the light felt like a struggle against an invisible force, the shadows tugging at his mind, warping his vision, making him question what was real and what was imagined. The walls seemed to stretch and compress, like a living organism, trapping him in a twisted nightmare that refused to release its grip. The whispers grew louder, more insidious, filling the space with an almost unbearable hum. They weren't just coming from the shadows anymore. They were inside his head, gnawing at his thoughts, corrupting his mind. The words were fragmented, but each one carried with it a crushing weight of terror. "You can't escape. You are ours now." Daniel's pulse quickened, his heart pounding in his chest, his vision blurring as panic seized him. His hands trembled uncontrollably, and sweat dripped down his forehead as he fought to focus on the light. But the shadows weren't letting him go so easily. They began to morph again, twisting into grotesque forms, pulling memories from his mind and distorting them into visions of terror. He saw faces, familiar, yet twisted. His father, who had died years ago, standing in the corner, his eyes hollow and vacant, his mouth twisted in a grotesque smile. His father stepped forward, his skin pale and peeling, whispering Daniel's name in a voice that was not his own. "You should have stayed away." Daniel recoiled in horror, his back hitting the wall as the vision dissolved into smoke, reforming into another figure, his mother, but not as he remembered her. She was a shadow of herself, gaunt and withered, her eyes sunken, her lips cracked and bloodied. She began humming a familiar lullaby, the same one she used to sing to him when he was a child. But now the melody was off, discordant, each note filled with a sense of wrongness that set his teeth on edge. The sound crawled under his skin, filling him with a deep, primal fear. The whispers twisted into mocking laughter, and the shadows grew bolder, shifting into terrible shapes that flickered in and out of his vision. They were feeding on his fear, and Daniel could feel his grip on reality slipping. His mind raced, the overwhelming terror distorting his sense of time, of space. He could no longer tell how long he had been in the cabin. Minutes? Hours? Days? The walls around him seemed to warp and pulse, like the beating of some enormous, unseen heart. Suddenly, the shadows surged forward, enveloping him, filling his vision with blackness. He couldn't breathe, couldn't move. The darkness pressed in on him from all sides, suffocating, oppressive, until he was sure it would crush him. His thoughts scattered, a torrent of terror-fueled visions that blurred the lines between the past and present. And then came the visions, twisted, nightmarish images of things that should not exist. His mother, reaching out with skeletal hands, his father, standing over his bed at night with hollow eyes, faces he did not recognize, but that screamed for him in agony. "We are all here, Daniel, waiting for you." The shadows were in his mind now, pulling at his deepest fears, unraveling the delicate threads of his reality. Daniel tried to shut them out, but it was impossible. Every vision, every whisper, every flicker of movement in the dark was designed to break him. He could feel the terror burrowing deeper into his psyche, twisting his perception, until he could no longer distinguish between what was real and what was not. His memories, once clear, now seemed like distant fragments, tainted by the presence of whatever evil dwelled in this place. And then the fear began to warp his mind further. He saw things that weren't there, or perhaps had always been there, hidden just beneath the surface of reality. The shadows no longer looked like formless beings. They had faces now, hollow eyes staring at him, twisted mouths muttering unintelligible words. The room itself seemed to shift around him, the walls stretching and bending in impossible ways, as though the cabin was alive, feeding off his terror. The floor beneath him creaked and groaned, as though it could collapse at any moment, dropping him into some dark abyss below. The shadows whispered a dark temptation, an insidious offer that wrapped around his mind like poison. Give in to the fear. Let us show you what lies beyond the veil. For a brief moment, Daniel felt an overwhelming urge to give up, to surrender to the darkness and let it take him. The fear had become so intense, so all-encompassing, that it seemed easier to let go, to stop fighting. The light in the corner of the room flickered, dimming as if to reflect his dwindling hope. The shadows pressed closer, their forms writhing and shifting, waiting for him to make his choice. But then, a thought pierced through the haze of fear. The light. It was still there, flickering, barely visible through the oppressive darkness. It was the only thing that felt real, the only thing that hadn't been corrupted by the shadows. Somehow, it called to him, pulling him back from the brink of despair. He had to reach it. He couldn't let the darkness take him, no matter how overwhelming the fear became. Summoning every ounce of strength he had left, Daniel forced himself to move. His legs felt like lead, his muscles burning with the effort, but he pushed forward, step by agonizing step, toward the light. The shadows hissed in frustration, their whispers turning into a deafening roar, but he ignored them. He couldn't give in, not now, not when he was so close. The light seemed to pulse, growing brighter as he neared it, cutting through the darkness like a beacon of hope. Just as his fingers brushed the edge of the glowing crack, a final whisper echoed in his mind, cold and venomous. "You can't escape us, Daniel. We are your fear, and we will always be with you." With one final burst of effort, Daniel plunged his hand into the light, and the world around him shattered into blinding white. The blinding white light engulfed Daniel, erasing the shadows, the whispers, and the suffocating presence of the cabin, if only for a moment. The world around him dissolved into a dizzying blur of brightness, and for a fleeting instant, he felt weightless, as though he had escaped. But the relief was short-lived. As his vision slowly adjusted, the light began to fade, and something else emerged from the void. A new space, twisted and unnatural, came into focus. He wasn't free. He was deeper inside the nightmare. The room he now stood in was familiar, yet distorted, like a forgotten memory twisted by time and fear. The walls were cracked, warped, and seemed to pulsate with a low, rhythmic hum, like the beating of a heart. The floor beneath him was uneven, littered with debris from a life that had once occupied this place. Broken furniture, old photographs, and shattered mirrors lay scattered around, reflecting fragments of his own terrified face back at him. And then, in the center of the room, he saw it. The mirror. It was tall, ancient, with an ornate, blackened frame that seemed to suck in the light around it. Its surface shimmered unnaturally, not like glass, but like a pool of dark water, rippling ever so slightly, as if something beneath it was moving. Daniel's heart sank as he realized this was where the shadows had been guiding him all along. He had not been running from them. He had been drawn to this. The mirror wasn't just a reflection. It was a doorway, a portal to whatever malignant force had been pulling the strings. A deep, unsettling whisper echoed from within the mirror, low and guttural, vibrating through the air around him. The voice was different from before, no longer the disembodied murmurs of the shadows. This was something more ancient, more powerful. Something that had been watching him long before he entered the cabin. "You've returned," the voice hissed, its tone dripping with malice. "You've always been a part of us, Daniel." His legs shook as he tried to back away, but his body was rooted in place, paralyzed by the growing dread that swirled around him. The mirror rippled again, and for the briefest moment, Daniel saw something in its surface, his own reflection. But it wasn't right. His reflection was staring back at him with eyes that weren't his, eyes that were black, hollow voids filled with unspeakable darkness. The reflection smiled, a twisted, malevolent grin that sent shivers down his spine. The voice came again, louder this time, more insistent. "You cannot fight what you are. The fear, it binds you to us." Daniel's breath caught in his throat as the reflection in the mirror began to move, stepping forward, out of sync with him. It reached out, pressing its hand against the glass, and the surface of the mirror began to ripple like water. The reflection stepped through. It was no longer a mere image. It was real, stepping into the room, a perfect copy of Daniel, yet something far more sinister. The eyes were black pits of nothingness, its skin pale and cold, and that smile was a grotesque mockery of his own face. The doppelganger tilted its head, studying him with an eerie calm. "You cannot run from your own darkness, Daniel. It's time to embrace it." Panic surged through him as the creature took a step closer, its movements slow, deliberate, as if savoring his fear. Daniel backed away, his mind racing, but there was no escape. He was trapped in the room, with the mirror at his back and this twisted version of himself closing in. The cabin had lured him here for a reason, and now he understood. The entity had been waiting for him to become it. "You've always known this was coming," the doppelganger whispered, its voice echoing in perfect harmony with the shadows. "The fear you carry, it's who you are. It's time to let go of who you once were and become what you're meant to be." Daniel's mind was a whirlwind of terror and confusion. He had spent his life running from the memories of the cabin, trying to forget, trying to live a normal life. But now, face to face with this nightmare made flesh, he realized that it had always been with him. The fear, the darkness, the shadows, they were a part of him, and they had been growing, waiting for this moment. The doppelganger raised a hand, and for a moment, Daniel's vision blurred. He saw flashes of his past, of moments of fear and doubt, times when the darkness had crept into his life. Small, subtle things that he had never noticed before. Each time, the shadows had been there, watching, waiting, feeding on his fear. And now, they were ready to claim him. The room began to close in on itself, the walls warping and twisting, the air growing colder, thicker. The doppelganger's smile widened, and with it, the room seemed to darken further, the shadows growing, enveloping everything. Daniel's heart raced as the entity stepped closer, reaching out with a hand that looked so much like his own, yet so alien. "The moment of truth," the voice whispered. "Will you join us, or will you fight the inevitable?" Daniel's breath came in ragged gasps. He knew what the entity wanted. It wanted him to surrender, to give in to the fear, to accept the darkness within himself. The choice was clear. He could embrace the shadows and lose himself forever, or he could fight. But how could he fight something that was already a part of him? Terror gripped his mind as the entity's hand drew closer, its cold fingers almost brushing against his skin. He had mere seconds to decide, to give in or resist. The air was thick with tension, the cabin itself pulsing with anticipation, waiting to see what he would do. In the pit of his stomach, Daniel felt the flicker of something else, something that had been buried beneath all the fear, the doubt, the terror. It was hope, a faint, fragile thing, but it was there. And with it came the realization that he wasn't just fighting the shadows. He was fighting for himself, for his soul. With a surge of determination, Daniel lashed out, shoving the doppelganger away from him. The creature's smile faltered, its eyes narrowing in confusion. The shadows roared in protest, the whispers turning to screams. But Daniel didn't care. He wasn't going to let them take him. "No!" he shouted, his voice trembling but strong. "I'm not yours. Not anymore." The mirror behind him shattered with a deafening crash, and in that instant, the room erupted into chaos. The shadows screamed, the doppelganger lunged at him, but Daniel was ready. He wouldn't let them consume him. Not now, not ever. The mirror exploded into countless shards, each one catching the flickering light as they scattered across the room. For a brief moment, the world seemed to freeze in place. The shadows recoiled, the doppelganger halted mid-lunge, and the oppressive hum that had filled the cabin vanished into an eerie silence. Daniel stood at the center of the chaos, his chest heaving, adrenaline surging through his veins. But even as the glass fragments rained down around him, he knew it wasn't over. The darkness wasn't finished with him. The doppelganger's twisted smile returned, though now its expression was more vicious, more determined. It rose from where it had been thrown back, dark tendrils snaking out from its body, connecting it to the shadows that clung to the walls. The broken mirror had only unleashed something far worse. The room began to tremble, the air thick with a palpable, malevolent energy. The walls groaned and cracked, as though something immense and powerful was pressing against them from the outside, trying to break through. "You cannot escape us, Daniel," the doppelganger hissed, its voice like nails scraping against his mind. "You have only made it worse." The shadows began to writhe, coiling like serpents around the room, growing darker and denser. They oozed from the cracks in the walls, spilling across the floor, merging together into one massive entity, a swirling vortex of blackness, filled with whispering voices, disembodied faces, and hollow, hungry eyes. The air grew colder, so cold that Daniel's breath formed white clouds in front of him. The temperature dropped further, and soon frost began to creep across the floor, crawling up the walls. The doppelganger seemed to grow in stature, looming over Daniel, its once human-like form warping into something monstrous, something barely recognizable. Its hands stretched out into claws, its face contorted into a hideous mockery of Daniel's own, but more grotesque, with its hollow, black eyes and impossibly wide, grinning mouth. The creature exuded pure malice, and the shadows danced at its feet, eager to devour their prey. Daniel's mind raced, terror flooding his senses. He was trapped. There was nowhere to run, no escape from this nightmare. The entity before him wasn't just a manifestation of his fear. It was his fear made real. Every doubt, every dark thought, every moment of terror from his past had coalesced into this thing, and it wanted to consume him. "This is your final chance," the creature growled, its voice resonating with the chorus of shadowy whispers that echoed through the cabin. "Join us, and you will never need to fear again. Deny us, and you will suffer forever." Daniel's legs trembled as the weight of the ultimatum settled over him. He had been fighting for so long, fighting the shadows, fighting the cabin, fighting his own past. And now, at the end, he was being asked to make the impossible choice. To surrender would mean losing himself completely, becoming part of the darkness that had haunted him all his life. But to refuse, the consequences of that were unthinkable. The entity wouldn't just let him walk away. It would drag him into the abyss, body and soul. But then, in the pit of his stomach, that small flicker of hope stirred again. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was enough. Enough to remind him of who he was, not the broken, fearful child who had once stumbled into these woods, but the man who had survived. The man who had faced his darkest memories and still stood, even now, when everything was collapsing around him. The doppelganger's grin widened as it sensed his hesitation, stepping forward with slow, deliberate movements, its claws outstretched. The shadows surged behind it, ready to engulf him the moment he faltered. But Daniel took a deep breath, steadying himself. He wouldn't let the darkness define him. Not again. Asterisk, asterisk, no. Asterisk, asterisk, Daniel said, his voice barely above a whisper, but filled with resolve. "I won't become you. I won't let the fear take me." The doppelganger snarled, its eyes narrowing into black, hate-filled slits. The shadows screamed in unison, and the room seemed to collapse inward as the entity lashed out with all its fury. The air became thick and oppressive, like tar, and Daniel felt himself being pulled toward the darkness. The shadows wrapped around his legs, his arms, dragging him down. The creature lunged, its claws aiming for his throat. But Daniel wasn't done fighting. Summoning the last of his strength, he reached out toward one of the shards of the broken mirror on the floor. His fingers brushed against the sharp edge, and without thinking, he grabbed it. Pain shot through his hand as the glass cut into his skin, but he held on tight. The light from the shard glowed faintly, reflecting something, the last fragment of himself that hadn't been swallowed by fear. With a desperate scream, Daniel plunged the shard into the doppelganger's chest. The creature let out a blood-curdling scream, its form shuddering violently as the light from the shard spread across its body like wildfire. The shadows recoiled, hissing and screeching as the light pierced through them. The doppelganger staggered back, clawing at its chest, trying to pull the shard free, but it was too late. The light expanded, growing brighter and brighter until it consumed the entire room. Daniel collapsed to the floor, gasping for breath as the shadows evaporated around him. The temperature slowly began to rise, the frost melting away. The air, once thick and suffocating, became lighter, and the oppressive weight that had hung over him was lifted. The doppelganger's form flickered and dissolved, its twisted grin fading as it was swallowed by the light. The whispers grew faint, then silent. The cabin seemed to breathe a final sigh, the walls creaking one last time before falling still. Daniel sat in the middle of the room, exhausted, but alive. The battle was over. The entity, the fear that had haunted him for so long, was gone. Or at least, it was for now. He glanced around the broken mirror, the fragments of glass scattered across the floor, and the eerie silence that had taken over the cabin. But as he got to his feet, something in the air still felt off. The light was gone, and though the darkness had retreated, it hadn't vanished completely. It lingered in the corners, faint and watchful. Daniel knew, in his heart, that the terror wasn't entirely vanquished. The cabin had let him go, but it hadn't been destroyed. The shadows would remain, waiting for another time, another person, to feed on. As he stepped out of the cabin, the air felt heavy with a lingering sense of dread. The forest was still, the trees whispering in the wind. Daniel knew the truth. This wasn't over. The darkness had been pushed back, but it hadn't been eradicated. It was always there, waiting, biding its time. And one day, it might return, for him or for someone else. As Daniel stepped outside the cabin, the dense, suffocating air gave way to the cold night breeze. The forest, now bathed in an eerie moonlight, felt no more welcoming than it had when he first arrived. But something was different. The overwhelming presence of the shadows was gone. The oppressive weight that had been bearing down on him throughout the night had lifted, leaving only an unsettling quiet in its wake. The silence was thick, unnatural, and somehow even more terrifying than the cacophony of whispers and roars that had filled the cabin. The forest felt dead, as though everything living had fled long ago, leaving only Daniel and the faint echoes of something sinister. He stood for a moment, breathing deeply, trying to shake the feeling that something was still watching him. The night was still, but his mind was racing. He had survived. He had faced the darkest parts of himself, confronted the twisted reflection of his fears, and walked out of the cabin alive. But something about it didn't feel like a victory. There was no sense of triumph, no release. Instead, there was an empty space inside him, a hollow, gnawing uncertainty. Daniel glanced back at the cabin, its dark, twisted silhouette barely visible in the moonlight. It looked abandoned, just as it had when he first saw it, a forgotten relic in the middle of a forest that time seemed to have forgotten. But he knew better now. The cabin wasn't just a building, it was alive, a conduit for something far more ancient and evil than he could ever fully understand. It had let him go, but it hadn't been defeated. He could still feel it, lurking just beneath the surface of reality, waiting for its next opportunity to pull someone else into its depths. As he turned away, intending to leave the forest and never look back, a faint noise stopped him dead in his tracks. At first, he thought it was just the wind, but the sound grew louder, more distinct, a soft, familiar melody drifting through the trees. His blood ran cold as recognition set in. It was the same melody from the music box, the one that had lured him deeper into the nightmare. The haunting, distorted tune echoed faintly, as if the forest itself were singing it. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. How could it be playing again? The music box had been broken, shattered in the chaos. He took a step back toward the cabin, his instincts screaming at him to run. But the melody pulled at him, tugging at the part of him that had always been drawn to the darkness. His heart pounded in his chest, and he fought the overwhelming urge to return, to see if the music box had somehow reassembled itself, or worse, if something else was playing that tune. The wind rustled through the trees, carrying the melody farther, until it seemed to surround him, echoing from all directions. Daniel's hands trembled as he fought against the pull. The cabin had let him leave, but it wasn't done with him. The shadows were still watching, waiting for him to falter. The darkness hadn't let him go. It had simply loosened its grip, for now. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. He had escaped, but only because the cabin had allowed it. The terror hadn't ended. It had just retreated, lurking in the background, waiting for the right moment to strike again. The melody grew louder, and with it, Daniel's pulse quickened. His thoughts raced, filled with the memories of what had happened inside those cursed walls. The visions, the whispers, the doppelganger. It all felt too real, too close, as if the line between the nightmare and reality had never been fully reestablished. He glanced over his shoulder, expecting to see the shadows creeping toward him, but the forest was still, too still. In that moment, Daniel realized something chilling. The cabin hadn't just manipulated his mind, it had planted something inside him. The fear, the darkness. It wasn't just in that place. It was in him now. The shadows had followed him out, not physically, but in his mind, in his soul. He could feel it, a creeping sensation at the edges of his thoughts, like a whisper he couldn't quite hear. It was subtle, but it was there, waiting for him to let his guard down. He looked back at the forest path, the way out seemingly clear, but he knew leaving wouldn't be the end. He could flee from the physical cabin, from the cursed woods, but the real terror had taken root inside him. No matter how far he ran, how much distance he put between himself and that cursed place, it would always be there, lurking in the corners of his mind, waiting for him to stumble into darkness again. And when he did, the shadows would return. Daniel took a step forward, away from the cabin, his body shaking with the weight of everything he had seen and endured. The music box melody faded into the distance, swallowed by the wind, but the fear remained. It clung to him like a second skin, seeping into his bones, his thoughts. There was no escaping it now. The terror wasn't just behind him, it was part of him. The shadows had won, in a way. They had claimed their place inside him, a presence he could never fully shake. As he walked deeper into the forest, the path home stretched out before him, but it no longer felt like an escape. It felt like he was walking towards something far worse than the cabin had ever been, a life lived in fear, constantly looking over his shoulder, knowing that the darkness could return at any moment. The whispers had faded, but their message was clear. This wasn't over. Daniel quickened his pace, but no matter how far he walked, the feeling of being watched never left him. The shadows might have retreated for now, but they weren't gone. They were waiting, patient and eternal, for the right moment to reclaim what they had started. He had survived the night, but the real nightmare was just beginning. And somewhere, deep in the heart of forest, the cabin remained, silent still, but always watching. Wait.